Welcome to another episode of Your Life Simplified. My name is Scott Sturgeon. I'll be the host for today's episode. And I'm excited to be doing so because our guest on the program today is Rochelle Clarke. She's the founder of Succession Strength Incorporated, a company that helps business owners protect their operations and really focus in on smoothly transitioning from its current ownership structure to potentially heirs of the family business. Rochelle is also the author of The 5 Critical Succession Conversations, a comprehensive guide for the family business. And as if that wasn't enough, she is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and has a storied career in working with a variety of different businesses of all different sizes. Rochelle, welcome to the show.
Scott, thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, the feeling is mutual. We're excited to have you on. So, Rochelle, really your kind of role, I guess, from kind of, previous conversations we've had is focusing in on succession planning for businesses. And I think a lot of that pertains to family businesses as well. Do you want to kind of, maybe for our listeners that maybe aren't as well versed in that, kind of explain what exactly a succession plan is?
Absolutely. So succession planning for family-owned businesses is essentially the process of identifying and preparing new leaders in the family. They could be in the family or outside of the family to take over from the older leaders when they leave the business, retire, or unfortunately pass away. And all of this is done with the objective of ensuring that the business continues into the future smoothly.
That's a great description. It sounds very simple. I guess that wraps up our episode. Great. Thanks for tuning in. No, completely kidding. No, as we'll get into, clearly there's a ton of nuance to that. I guess just out of curiosity, it's very much a niche practice. What drew you to working in this space?
So the way it started for me is that I grew up in a family-owned business. I grew up in and around family-owned businesses. But I pursued a career in the corporate world. I was a consultant for a number of years, and then I moved into industry. But a few years ago, I found myself being drawn back to one of the businesses within our family that had a little bit of a succession crisis, so to speak. And in helping that family out, what I recognized is that quite a few family-owned businesses are just as vulnerable. So it was at that point that, the seed for succession strength really took root. And that's when I decided to start the company to really serve as, let's say, a part-time referee, part-time strategic coach for families in business that are approaching or coming up to a succession, or those that just have some issues within the business that they need some expertise in getting over.
Sure. So I think just to provide a good base for our conversation, what exactly, does that process look like for you when you engage a family and in a business that's maybe been run by a founder for many years and they're looking to transition on to the next generation? What is there a specific process you go through, or is it all contingent on situation? Could you kind of walk through that a little bit?
Absolutely. And it's definitely situational because families bring us in for a number of issues. But essentially what it is that we speak with the family member who has brought us in. We have an initial conversation or an initial meeting with that person to understand what their issue is. After that, we typically have interviews with different or key members of the family or family business, because there could be key employees whose input is also valuable. And the reason that we do that is to get a full understanding of what the issue is and where the issue or issues might lie. We then have a group meeting with all of the key members of the family to go over or to present what we feel the issues that we would have discussed before are. And it is during that session, very, very open discussion, it is during that session that we really prioritize what issues the family wants to address and tackle. And we work with the family in addressing those issues and provide support for them afterwards. So we never really step away unless and until the family is fully supported and fully integrated into their new role.
It's really interesting. It sounds like a very much kind of a combination of an emotional approach. Well, I guess the coach and referee, as you mentioned, but family dynamics are always a little tricky. I think that they vary widely between groups. Just as
Most
maybe.
definitely.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of the questions that came up in my mind when you're meeting with families and you're kind of having those conversations, what do you generally how do you generally approach, maybe it's, looking at the dynamics of the family to say, which child would be a good fit, or how do you encourage a child to take over a business? Is there a playbook for that, or is it kind of just on the fly?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be quite honest, I'll just be very, very clear. That's something that we do not do. We do not persuade anyone to take over any role within the family business. And the reason for that is that we believe that this should come organically from the person themselves. What we do is we sit with the family members, we observe their interactions, we hear from, the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, whoever's in charge of the business, what their take is on who they believe should take over the business. And we do what is called a skills gap analysis. Now, in that skills gap analysis, what we do is we evaluate that person to get a full understanding of where they are along their development path in relation to assuming their intended role in the business. And coming out of that, we then, have the conversation with that person, of course, to understand their intentions as well. Because it's one thing to say that, Suzanne is, she's fully equipped. She has what it takes in terms of the training to take over the business. But I don't know, maybe Suzanne wants to go surfing and own a shack on the beach. Now, in that scenario, we don't want to take on the role of trying to persuade Suzanne or anyone else to assume a role that doesn't come naturally for them. And the reason for this is that what you find is that if someone is in a role that they really do not want to be in, or that they feel a heavy obligation to be in, when the rubber of owning a business and of running a business, when that rubber hits the road and times get tough, it's usually very hard for that person to reach deep down inside and really see the business through for the benefit of the business and the employees who might be there. So it's really a matter of coming to the table and getting a full understanding of everyone's intentions before we then take a look at what the potential next steps are in terms of who takes over the business. Because sometimes, if we have enough time to go through this exercise, perhaps someone within the business is not the right person to take over. And in that case, we then go to an external person or do a search externally to find someone to take over the business. But that usually takes some time. So, there's definitely the impetus to start early.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's the passion piece has to be huge. I think, or really for anyone in any career that you choose, you're going to be, I think, just in general, much better at whatever you do. And you're going to have much more of a commitment to that if you really have the passion for it at the end of the day. So I think it makes perfect sense to have that approach. Certainly having a resume fitting of the job is key, but I have a hunch that piece you just described is incredibly important. As you look over the long term, I pulled just some statistics, and I'm sure these aren't surprising to you, but from the Family Business Institute, roughly 30% of family-owned businesses survive into the second generation, and then 12% survive into the third generation. And I guess in looking at those numbers, number one, are you surprised? And number two, do you sense that there's likely, I don't want to say a failure, but maybe a lack of just that type of planning that you described?
Yes, as you say, those statistics are not surprising to me at all. And for anyone who's actually worked in a family-owned business, you get it. You're probably shaking your head right now saying, yep, sounds about right. The statistics are very dismal when it comes to the success of family-owned businesses into the future. And it's unfortunate, but it comes down to, like you say, intentional planning. Because there are certain things that successful family-owned businesses have done to get to their levels of success. And unfortunately, many more have not duplicated or replicated that playbook.
I think, yeah, it seems like it's probably just not top of mind for a lot of business owners. You're very stressed, or much of your time is consumed in running the day to day operations of the business to ensure its success over the long term. Providing for your family or your loved ones or what have you. That future looking piece just maybe isn't there as much, or the thought at least to have conversations around who's actually going to take over when I leave, as opposed to simply just, all right, what's going to be the selling price of this business, or something to that effect.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. When it comes to, the business owners are deep in the weeds sometimes, trying to get the business going or running from day to day. And time really, really goes very, very quickly. So unfortunately, sometimes by the time they recognize the need for this type of planning, it can be too late. But what we always say is, listen, in a family-owned business, the onus of the success or the responsibility for the success of the business lies with everyone in the family. So it's not necessarily only on the leader, the named leader, to take charge when it comes to these conversations or ensuring that some of this action is taken, but everyone in the family has the responsibility of at least ensuring that this is a topic that's on the radar. And that can be done in a number of ways.
Sure. I that's maybe actually a good segue. Some of our very brief conversation prior to today, you referenced some what you call conversation guides, and my question had originally pertained to what are the biggest pain points you see in the transition of a business. But it sounds like kind of the conversation guides you mentioned address some of those. So I found those really interesting. Could you kind of touch on what those are and kind of what that entails?
Absolutely. And coming back to your initial question, the biggest pain points when it comes to transitioning a business, sadly, 60% of the businesses that fail to transition will fail because of communication issues. 60%, 60. And a further 25% will fail because of insufficient preparation. Now, if you add these together, that's 85% of the failure rate of these transitioning family-owned businesses are due to what, some of us would term very, very controllable areas: communication, preparation. But I think, the on the surface, it looks simple, and that's what lulls a lot of families into a state of inactivity when it comes to these areas. And it's the inactivity or the inability to take action that's what ends up becoming an issue in the long run. So communication is the number one reason, followed by preparation. And yes, the conversation guides that we spoke about. So what our team ended up doing is saying, okay, there are a number of key conversations that we know families in business are not having, and for a number of reasons. There's a lot of hesitation when it comes to having these conversations, just because there's so much on the line. You're talking about a family dynamic that, folks more or less don't want conflict in their family. They may think, okay, if it's just a business that I can walk away from, that's fine, but not with my family members. I don't want that type of conflict. So there's a hesitation when it comes to having those conversations. So what we've done, and this is through the behavioral psychologist on the team, we've created a number of conversation guides that essentially provide a step-by-step set of advice for families to help them handle these tricky conversations. So that's what the conversation guides are about. And there are about 18 of them, although we have 3 of them that are the top sellers related to having that initial conversation about who takes over the business. The second one is around performance management. So how do we ensure that family members are pulling their weight in the business? And the third one is, how do we prevent this business from really taking over our lives? And those are the top 3 ones, but there are about 18 of them that are available.
It's really interesting. It seems like, I think for even just a business owner off the street, as if, there's tons of them walking around the street, but I have to think that even if you had owned a business for many years and you had, it had come into mind, wow, I should maybe look at succession planning or how do I transition out of this? I don't know that it would immediately come to mind to have those types of thought processes in place, to have those types of conversations, or even where the heck do I even begin? I think it's so important to have that, and it makes total sense. Even just listening to you just describe at a high level, it's like, well, yeah, they should probably have that type of conversation. That would seem to make complete sense. But it seems that there just isn't. I just can't think it would be very difficult, I think, for someone who really hasn't spent the time, like you have, to really think through those processes and come at it from both that kind of organizational aspect and then also the psychological element as well. Seems to be really huge.
It is, and that's the feedback that we've received. Because you can have successors who really don't have any intention or want to take over the business, but they're just going along day by day, knowing that, let's say, for example, if it's their parent, knowing that their parent intends to pass this business on to them. But no one's really stepping up and addressing the elephant in the room, so on both sides. So it's the successor not stepping up and saying, yeah, by the way, this is where my interest really lies. And of course, there's the owner or the person in charge not stepping up and saying, by the way, these are my intentions. Are you on board? What are your plans?
Sure. That makes total sense.
Thanks again for downloading this episode of Your Life Simplified, which is produced by Mariner Wealth Advisors. And at Mariner Wealth Advisors, we're here to serve as your advocate. We help people chart a course to reach their personal and financial goals so that they can have greater peace of mind that may lead to a more fulfilling life. We do this by always putting our clients first. Because as fiduciaries, we're required to provide guidance that's in the best interest of clients, not in the best interest of a company or shareholders or anyone else. So as you listen to this podcast and have questions about maybe your own financial situation, or would simply like a second opinion, or even you have an idea for a future podcast, please go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. If you found the information on this podcast valuable, please go ahead and share it with a friend or family member that you think might benefit from this information. And please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode.
No, that's actually probably a good segue. One of the items I'd wanted to touch on, and we kind of addressed it in a few light ways, but family dynamics, I think just what immediately comes to mind when I think about succession planning, family dynamics is, Hollywood has maybe done a service or disservice to, presenting what I would almost phrase as a caricature of, maybe there's the like you mentioned, the patriarch or matriarch who's run the business for many years, who's very set in their ways. There's maybe the rebellious oldest son or the very astute younger daughter who's the prime candidate to take over, and there's conflict there. When you get into scenarios like that, I think kind of playing that coach and referee role, how does that conversation look like if you have multiple children or multiple family members kind of competing, or there's tension as to what the next step is going to be? Is there a certain approach you take to diffusing that? Is it kind of sticking to the process? Is it deviating from that? What does that really look like?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, Scott. To be quite honest, there's no set playbook that we use when we deal with all of our families. Instead, what we do is we assess each situation as it comes. So what are we seeing here? What are we hearing here? And this is through observation and through conversation with the key family members. But coming out of that, what you say is, absolutely right. Maybe, Hollywood is taking a little bit of liberty. But to be quite honest, working in some family businesses can be very tough. One of the most impactful things that we do in workshops with the families is around their values. Knowing and being guided by the family's values helps to keep family members grounded. So in a lot of cases where, there's a lot of conflict going on there, of course, I'm not sugarcoating this or saying that it's easy. Of course, there can be other issues, but what we have found is that in many cases, the family members are not really aware of what the guiding values and the guiding principles are for the business. And in the absence of that, in the absence of them being able to say, this is the business, this is what we're about, this is our intended purpose. Without those strong values, what you find is that individual values start to play out. So, it's the one who wanted to do, he's more about business and earning money. And, whereas the family may be coming at it from a more philanthropic position. So you could have a number of issues and a number of ways that this can play out. So long answer to your question is by saying each family, as they come in, we assess them individually to determine what the best way would be for us to, solve the issue that they have brought us in for.
A long answer, but a good answer. It seems like that value piece is vital to success. And it's, even from perhaps a mother owns the business and the son is looking to potentially take over, as you mentioned, if the mother is very much focused on maintaining quality of products within the business, whereas the son specifically is looking to expand the business substantially, and as a result of that, potentially reduce quality of a product, a widget, whatever the business may be producing, there's a potential for issue there, and addressing that from the front seems immensely more helpful than simply just handing the keys to the son and saying, well, best of luck, we'll see how it goes.
Absolutely. And, one of the things, Scott, is that, remember, a lot of this tension doesn't only sit with the family members. You also have to keep in mind the impact that this has on the employees and others who work in the business. So, operating a business is stressful enough without the unnecessary stresses of employees having to deal with the family drama. So it can be frustrating for employees and in some cases, some customers or some vendors if they become aware of turbulence within the family, because this can really damage the relationship. So, for example, what you were saying about the son, wanting, let's say, cheaper products and to expand faster. Well, think about this scenario. If he's working in a manufacturing company where all of the employees were fully bought into his mother's vision of providing high quality work, when the son then comes in with his grand plans of, blowing things up and really, really expanding very quickly, he not only has to contend with his mother, so to speak, but then he's also contending with employees who may not be in agreement with his approach. They can end up sabotaging his work and sabotaging the direction that he's trying to take in ways that may be known or unknown to him. So some of this conflict that we see sometimes plays out on the stage of the business in a way that's very, very not intended.
That makes total sense. I candidly hadn't even considered that aspect or element of things. It really is an entirely holistic approach. You have to be looking at all elements of the business. How does that, specific business line or specific employee group or team or what have you fit into the grander, vision or values of the company? That makes total sense. It's a really interesting point.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when you look at, I'll just focus specifically on children as taking over or moving into the business to kind of start working in the family company. From what your experience has shown you, do you think that there is credence to having that we'll just say child, maybe they're an adult or what have you, but having that child step into more of an executive or senior role or leadership role within the company from the get-go? Or do you find it's best to have them start day one in the mailroom or, entry-level positions to work their way up, really gain a full experience of what goes on within the company to then really, take on leadership roles down the road? Is there a specific best practice you see there? Does it really matter? I was just curious.
And it's a good question that you raised. To answer, what I would say is let's keep in mind that successors for a family-owned business are not only minors. In this day and age, with people living much longer, what you might find is that you have people potential successors coming from multiple generations. So you can have a successor to a business who is in their 50s or in their 40s or in their 30s. So when you talk successor, it's not just about a minor or someone just coming out of college. So to answer with that context in mind, what I would say is that when it comes to that person, a successor taking over, it really depends on their level of experience in relation to their intended role in the business. This is why we do the skills gap analysis, to really understand and really develop a preparation plan for that person and to hold them accountable along the way to ensure that their goals are met. What we find is that if a family member is young enough with sufficient time to prepare, then the longer experience rotating through multiple departments within the business may indeed be one of the recommendations. But it really starts with that family member to understand what their true desires are for the business. And then we can then strategically explore options for themselves and for the business when that time comes. In terms of, let's say, I don't want to say a minor necessarily, but a younger successor who is perhaps in their early teens or early 20s, when it comes to preparing for a succession, timing is important. The amount of time that this person has to prepare, because in all fairness, you need to give them sufficient time to take over a business that might have taken decades to build. It's a little bit unfair for, an outgoing leader to say, yep, I'm retiring in 2 years. See ya. Figure things out.
Right. So time frame is key.
May have had the benefit. Yeah, that's really, really key. So, just doing some quick math, back of the envelope math. And I don't know for yourself or for your listeners, if they're in this situation where they are a family-owned business and they have a potential successor coming on board or thinking of passing the business on, if that successor is, let's say, has just graduated from high school, and assuming that that successor is intending on going off to college, a 4-year U.S. college, let's do some math. So you take the 4 years that person will spend in college, and then we want to add some time because ideally it's usually good for them to get some outside experience. And the reason for that is so that they have the experience of being managed by someone who is not, whose name is not on the company,
right,
so to speak. So it helps them, build that ability to be well managed, and to, of course, this helps them be good managers at the end of the day. So let's give them about 2 to 3 years of outside experience. Of course, this can vary, but let's say on average 2 to 3 years. And then to that second number, let's add, of course, inside experience, because they're coming in to potentially take over this business. So we would hope that they would have spent a substantial amount of time trying to get to know and understand this business. Let's say on average 3 to 5 years. And of course, these figures are, they're not the rule. They would be based on the complexity of the organization, of course. So how are we doing on the math? We've got 4 years for them to be in college, 2 to 3 years of outside experience. Inside experience, let's say 3 to 5 years. What you're looking at, timeline, you're at least talking 9 to 12 years. But guess what? Let's throw another curveball in there. Suppose your intended successor at the end of college decided, or in the middle, decides, you know what? I don't want to do business anymore. I want to study biology because I want to be a scientist. Well, there goes your plan of having that potential successor take over the business.
Yeah. So plan changes drastically at that point.
So, this timeline, this 15-year timeline, gives a little bit of wiggle room so that you can adjust, if plans do end up changing as they can. So if you're about to retire and you have a successor who is in this position and you're giving them less than 15 years, then you really need to explore what the options are to ensure that they are well equipped to take over and to run and manage this business. Because there are other solutions that can be found to ensure that the business is well supported while they get the time that they need to prepare.
Sure. But much better to have those options, or to research those options at least, as essentially the time frame you've described, which I think makes sense, to really be, have all your ends covered, is essentially almost a multi-decade process, really being intentional
Absolutely.
about what you're going to do. That makes total sense.
Absolutely. But actually what we find, Scott, is that successful family businesses, they don't just, wake up one day and stumble into success. I mean, most of them are not shouting it from the rafters. They're not, shouting what their playbook is. But some of them take and the ones that we have seen and the ones that we have heard of and read about, I should say, have taken a very intentional approach to their succession. So they plan and they prepare for the success that they seek. And they do this tangibly by putting plans in place and by preparing their members of the younger generation. They can be preparing multiple ones at the same time, but also in the mindset, right? So it's in the tangible plans, but also in the mindset. So what values will the business be guided by, and what will keep this business together in the event that there is conflict or disturbances? And that tends, the glue that holds the family together tends to be the values. So successful family businesses are really taking a very intentional approach to ensure that they are being able to pass on successfully from generation to generation. And when things stall, they get help. So many of the businesses will run into trouble. But, these businesses don't ever think that communication issues are small or fixable or without consequence. I don't know if you've heard of this saying, Muhammad Ali, he said in one of his quotes, it isn't the mountains ahead to climb that wear you out. It's the pebble in your shoe.
I've not.
The pebble in your shoe.
That makes total sense.
Right? It does. And for us, I think it highlights that it truly is the little things. But, the smarter family-owned businesses don't let these issues sit, because they just know the potential impact that they can have. So they take action immediately. We have some clients who, just at the hint of conflict or just at the hint of tough situations, they call us up on the phone and they say, hey, I'm going into this. How should we approach it? And, a lot of them say that they take the role not necessarily as owners of the business, but as custodians or caretakers of the business, where they're caring for this business for the next generation. And this is why they're taking the approach of avoidance is better than cure, and handling these issues before they come up.
Sure. That makes complete sense. Well, Rochelle, this has been, in my opinion, incredibly informative. A lot of this I candidly had not even considered. Clearly, I am not quite keyed to be a succession planning, knowledgeable on the topic at least, but having this conversation with you has been really informative, and I certainly appreciate you taking the time today to chat with us. I guess I would actually just before we part, I would ask one final question, and that's, if you had one very simple, concise suggestion for business owners who maybe hadn't even thought about this, maybe they're listening to this, had never even thought about it, what would be the single biggest piece of advice you could convey to them?
Yeah, so for me, it would be, listen, you don't know what you don't know. So get out there, and we actually have a free assessment on our website where anyone can just go on and families can know where their issues lie within the family business, and they can get some recommendations on how to solve those. So, don't let ignorance be the stumbling block for your family's continuity, is what I would say. And then, of course, the conversation guides are out there if you're at that stage, but knowledge, I think, is the most important thing. So
sure.
If they do the free assessment, they're able to pinpoint what their issues are.
And that's successionstrength.com. Ignorance is bliss, unless you own a business, in which case it is not bliss.
Exactly.
It's a bad succession plan in the making.
very bad.
Very bad. Well, Rochelle, listen, thank you so much again for coming on today. We really appreciate you taking the time. Again, much appreciate it.
Scott, thank you so much for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. As always, if you have thoughts or suggestions or ideas of topics that you'd like to hear, by all means, we really encourage you to reach out to us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. Thanks for tuning in.
Mariner Wealth Advisors, or MWA, is an SEC registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Kansas. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which it is notice filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with a prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website at www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money.